So I've just been browsing videos on a number of things, particularly Trump's victory speeches after the election. But I came across one video with Piers Morgan defending Donald Trump. Now, Piers Morgan is one of the world's best known journalists. I think that's a fair statement. He's very high profile in the UK and he's now quite well known in the US as well. So he's a pretty famous person in his own right. And his evolution is very interesting. This is a guy who's went from being a right-wing tabloid editor. Years ago, he was the editor of the News of the World, which was pretty right-wing. Then he went to being a left-wing tabloid editor. The Daily Mirror was to the left. Then he joined, I believe it was CNN, where the American right very much saw him as a liberal. And now he's coming out as a defender of Trump. So that means one of two things. Either Piers Morgan is like myself, a centrist, and he has that both left wing and right wing ideology, or he is completely immoral and without any sort of values and just flip flops from allegiance to allegiance. I actually believe it is more likely to be the former. Now, I'm no fan of tabloid editors, believe me, but this guy might just be the one tabloid editor I respect. Anyway, he was defending Donald Trump from the liberal attacks apparently against him. Interestingly enough, Piers Morgan considers himself a friend of Donald Trump. Now, on this particular video, it was on Britain's Good Morning programme. I noticed a lot of Trump supporters and right wing Americans were lining up to firstly say they were surprised by it because they viewed Morgan as a liberal, but also to say things like, oh, if only he could now get educated on guns and this sort of thing. It's Piers Morgan's position on guns that I particularly want to discuss because I think, and I've looked a lot of his debates and a lot of the segments that he's been involved in. I think it's unfortunate that he is being totally misrepresented. The attitude of Second Amendment cultists, and I am putting it that way, and I will explain why I'm putting it that way in a second. But their attitude is that Morgan is some sort of communist who wants to come in and grab the guns. Not once, not once has he indicated that. And when I talk about Second Amendment cultists, I want to be very, very clear about this, and I want to lay out my own position on guns. I've made videos about this before, but now is as good a time as any to talk about it. What I detest about the gun lobby is the way they portray their opponents as wanting to grab guns and the way they distort the situation so that anyone who advocates gun regulation is completely against the Second Amendment. I talk about Second Amendment cultists because I do believe that they hold the Second Amendment higher than the First Amendment, the right to freedom of expression. I also believe that they take it out of context. What the founding fathers said, and you don't need to be an expert on the Constitution to see this, was that they advocated a well-regulated militia. Since when did a well-regulated militia get translated as any Tom, Dick, or Harry or Sally can have any weapon they want? The problem I take with the gun lobby is they're extremes. And I really wish responsible gun owners would just understand that most people who regulate gun regulation, I mean, who advocate gun regulation, don't want to take away everyone's guns. In many cases, they themselves are gun owners. That really isn't the issue. And even if that was what they wanted, they know full well it's impossible. Um, I detest the lies on this. I detest the way the NRA distorts it and scares people. I mean, what have we been hearing for the past 8 years? Oh, Obama's going to grab your guns. Hillary's going to grab your guns. The Democrats want to grab your guns. I am yet to see one viable example of a law abiding citizen having their firearms taken away in 8 years of this scaremongering. And in those 8 years, we've had Aurora, Sandy Hook, Charleston. The list goes on and on and on. Massacre after massacre after massacre. This is one area I am well aware I could be portrayed as left wing or a liberal, so be it. I staunchly believe in common sense gun regulation. I am very grateful to live in a country where, in my view, we have got this right. Guns are lethal weapons. Analogies with cars are stupid, because cars are foremost designed as a mode of transport. So when people say, oh, cars kill people, but we don't ban cars, you're missing the point. Cars aren't meant to kill people. They're designed foremost as a mode of transport. Guns are designed as lethal weapons to kill. Now, people might think that I'm being entirely one sided in this, so let me try and explain my position. I'm not against all guns, not at all. In fact, I absolutely have no problem with people buying guns to protect themselves or their family, buying guns because they do it for sport, target practice, shooting ranges, that sort of thing, or buying guns as um, because it's for genuine self-defense purposes, or if they're law enforcement or soldiers. But I do take issue with some of the more extreme aspects of this. I believe that open carry is madness. I believe that's inviting Wild West style irresponsibility, because the idea that you could have someone with a loaded firearm walking into a McDonald's or a cinema, a movie theater, that to me is just madness. Why the hell does anyone need to carry a loaded firearm around? There's a world of difference between that and having it in your own home for protection. Now, people who live in areas with high crime, I can definitely sympathise with that. If I lived in a rough neighbourhood and I could legally buy a firearm, I probably would as a deterrent. So, in no way am I saying, there should be no guns. But what I despise is the way the gun lobby distorts it. And that's what they do every bloody time. Literally bloody. So Piers Morgan's being attacked by the gun lobby. I think it's totally unfair because they're misinterpreting what his position was. He never once said that he wanted nobody to have guns. He laid out his position very clearly. Yes, he was pro gun regulation. Gun regulation doesn't mean banning all guns, never has. And what I cannot understand is people who really are responsible gun owners, why would you have any issue with what Piers Morgan or others are saying? If you really are a responsible gun owner, fine, you're not going to have your guns taken away. What the hell is wrong with reasonable background checks? I just cannot understand the logic of people who oppose that. As for saying things like, oh, well, gun free zones, this is what happens, i.e., when there's a shooting in a state or a city that has tougher gun regulation. But you have to ask, well, where are the guns sourced? Each state has different legislation on this. So if it was uniform across the country, let's say, for example, whole United States had tough gun regulation and then these shootings continued to happen, then the question would be fair enough. Gun regulation isn't working. But the point is, it isn't uniform, and there are states with much, much softer gun laws. So I think it's very plausible that in cities like Chicago or in other areas where there is high gun violence rates, just look at where the weapons are sourced. And I think you'll find that it isn't internal. I think you'll find it's coming from out of state in areas where it is easy to access firearms. Now, the fact is this: in both Britain and Japan, two countries with tough gun regulation, we have extremely low gun homicide rates. That is an inescapable fact. The United Kingdom has 65 million people. 65 million people. That's the 22nd most populous country in the world, and yet we have less than 100 gun homicides per annum. This is a simple fact. Japan, it's even lower. In fact, in Japan, it's almost been entirely eradicated. Not totally, but almost entirely. Japan's got even more people than Britain. The point I'm making is that, and this is another thing that irritates me about the gun lobby, they always present gun regulation as being akin to dictatorships. To say, oh, Hitler had gun control, Mao had gun control. Well, the point about dictators is they ban everything, they control everything, so that doesn't really prove anything. Because democratic countries like Britain and Japan, contemporary Britain and Japan, have tough gun regulation. It's a simple realization that these are lethal weapons and not everyone should have access to them. I do not understand the mentality of the gun lobby, and I admit this does get me quite worked up because it's just misguided. It's just so stupid, and it's the scaremongering that pisses me off. This idea that gun regulation equals taking guns away. No, it doesn't. It's simply about instilling reasonable background checks. It's simply about trying to ensure that mentally ill people that shouldn't have firearms don't get them. Look at the recent attack in Fort Lauderdale. Now, how the hell did that guy have access to guns? How? He had went into FBI center, as I understand it, in Alaska, and actually told them that he was worried about himself. At that point, there should have been an absolute guarantee that he could not access firearms. Now, why would anyone disagree with that? Because the gun lobby are always quick to say, oh, we need to look at mental illness. So why not then have a reasonable agreement that people who are mentally unstable shouldn't have access to firearms? I cannot comprehend why anyone would disagree with that. And this is the ironic thing. Most gun owners actually, on some level, do support gun regulation. They just don't know that they do because they're fed this bullshit by the NRA that gun regulation equals controlling. I think probably gun regulation is a better way to put it because gun control does send out the message that it's about taking away Second Amendment rights. But I would add this point the Second Amendment is only one amendment. The First Amendment, freedom of expression, is equally, if not more important, which is why it was the First Amendment. Now, there are gun advocates out there who want to violently threaten people who have a different point of view. I've been very critical recently of the behaviour of some left wing activists, but this is one side of the right I cannot stand. And frankly, when you have gun extremists, getting in people's faces and putting up bullet marks against politicians that disagree with them, that for me is a big problem. So, summed up, I'm not anti guns, I'm just pro common sense regulation, and I cannot comprehend why any gun owner would have issue with that. I just don't get it. So these attacks on Piers Morgan, yeah, I'm defending Piers Morgan because I think he's being totally misinterpreted. He's being presented as this gun grabbing liberal. All he is someone who believes in reasonable gun regulation. Now, what's Trump going to do about gun violence in America? I'll tell you what, not a damn thing, which is like most of the Republican field. And Obama couldn't do a lot because he was constantly held up by a Republicans in Congress trying to block reasonable legislation. And people say, "Oh, criminals are going to get guns anyway." The point I would make is gun regulation isn't going to affect law-abiding gun owners because if you're not a criminal, you've got nothing to worry about. You're still going to be able to legally buy firearms. If you are a law-abiding citizen, if you're not mentally unstable and you don't beat up your wife, you have nothing to worry about. And yet, the impression I'm getting from the right is huge paranoia. Present some evidence that the government, well, it's a new government now, but there's just no evidence that the Obama government was going to take away firearms. At best, there was conspiracy theories stirred up by the likes of Alex Jones, and I just think it's nonsense. And I just think it's sad that every time these tragedies happen, I was looking at a video of George Bush speaking in the wake of Virginia Tech, and Katie Couric asked the very important question about gun regulation. Bush gave a very safe and very typical Republican answer. Oh, it's terrible what's happened, but I don't want to talk about gun regulation. He just skirted around the issue. And he was very thoughtful and sentimental about the families and all the rest of it. But in the end of the day, when the right says, or when Republicans, when gun extremists say like, "Oh, it's not the right time to talk about this," my thinking is, well, wait a second, when is the right time? How many massacres is going to be too many? And frankly, if the gunning down of children at Sandy Hook doesn't change opinions, nothing will. So I think it's a very sad situation. There's many things I like about the United States. The extremism of the gun lobby is not one of them. And the idea that if someone is pro-gun regulation, there's some bleeding heart liberal, not at all. I'm conservative on crime. I absolutely support the right for people to have firearms to protect their family, for example. So I don't want to grab guns. But I'll leave it there. I just think it's really unfortunate how this is taken hugely. There's just so many lies out there, and it's bullshit. And by the way, for those gun control advocates who do want to take away all guns, I would say to them that isn't going to happen. It isn't practical, and it does overlook the crime issue where people want guns to protect themselves and their family. But they are a minority. Most gun regulation advocates don't propose that. They just don't. And I just think it's unfortunate how it isn't just the NRA, there's other people who just spread fear. And they say that those politicians who advocate gun regulation want to grab guns. No, they don't. There's no evidence whatsoever for that. If you're a gun owner and you're a law abiding citizen, you have nothing to worry about. It's a siege mentality and it's creating a Wild West situation. That's why when you get like open carry, for me, those people just have a Wild West mentality and they're living in a fortress. They're living in this idea that they go into, a town centre, they're going to be in a shootout. And there's many more things I could say about this subject, but I'll just add one more. This idea, and Trump has promoted it many times, that let's say there's a terrorist attack. This notion that if every civilian was armed, it wouldn't happen is rubbish. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that guns were allowed in schools, right? Let's say teachers had guns and, God forbid, students had guns. I think that's reckless, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, that was the case. No amount of training would prepare someone for that instantaneous shock of a spree shooter. So even if they did get themselves together to take the shooter out, it wouldn't be before already some people had died. I can only think of one sole example. It was the Killeen shooting in Texas in 1991, where one of the victims of that atrocity, I think she managed to shoot the shooter. But that's the only example I can think of. There's been so many other spree shootings where there's just no evidence that having guns would stop that. Because even if you train people, no amount of training would prepare them for the real thing. So the issue here is the easy abundance of guns. Saying criminals will get them anyway isn't good enough. You know what? Britain has criminals. Japan has criminals. Every country has crime. Every country has criminals. But not every country has a level of gun violence that the United States does. And I'm not saying it's the worst. You could point to certain examples in Latin America and some other parts of the world where it is worse. But it's not exactly a good comparison because those are developing countries often that have been through political turmoil. The United States is supposedly the world's most powerful country. Now, in this area, it's a very long way behind as far as I'm concerned when it comes to public safety. Um, and how do you tell? Oh God, there's so many things I can come out with here that I can raise. How do you tell the good guy with the gun? So you're saying citizens should have a right to just carry around guns? How do you know that's going to be a spree shooter or someone just upholding their Second Amendment right? How do you tell? There's no way to tell so long as open carry prevails. Because someone comes into a bar and they're carrying a weapon, there's no way to know if they're a spree shooter or they're just someone upholding their Second Amendment. That doesn't even take into account accidents. Take, for example, the school example. Let's say you arm all students. Now, let's say two of the students got into a fist fight. What's to stop them bringing out a gun in the heat of the moment, shooting a classmate? There's so many issues at stake here, and I just think it's very sad that it could be that if I was living in the States, my approach to this would be different. I don't think it would. I don't consider myself a gun control extremist because I am not against all guns. I'm not against gun ownership. All I'm saying is let's be reasonable and let's not assume that just because someone's talking about gun regulation, they want to grab guns. And in the end of the day, if you really are a law abiding gun owner, why would you have any issue with background checks? Why?